there will be large income losses from this crisis. By end of 2020, the region will face income losses of about 200 billion relative to where we thought they would be just like 6 months ago.
In this program, IMF economist Papa Ndiaye on Sub-Saharan Africa's outlook amid COVID-19.
Failing to contain this outbreak would have catastrophic health and humanitarian consequences.
Welcome to this podcast produced by the International Monetary Fund. I'm Bruce Edwards. Sub-Saharan Africa is facing an unprecedented health and economic crisis that threatens to reverse much of the development progress it's made in recent years. Papa Ndiaye is head of research in the IMF's African department, which publishes the region's economic outlook. Ndiaye says the latest projections for Sub-Saharan Africa show the economy will contract by 1.6% this year, the worst reading on record. So Sub-Saharan Africa was making good progress until the pandemic hit. Do you see this as a temporary interruption, or does the pandemic risk reversing the development progress in the longer term?
Thank you, Bruce. You're right. The region was making tremendous progress toward achieving its sustainable development goals. There was a lot that remained to be done, but we had seen very good things happening in terms of improvement on educational attainment, for example, reduction in poverty rates. We moved from something like 60% in the early 2000s to 40%, which is still very high, but some improvement there. The people's lifespan increased. And when you look at the income of people, there was a rapid convergence and increases in per capita income throughout the region in the 2000s and going all the way to 2015. And at that time, some bifurcation happened between resource-rich countries and less resource-rich countries because of the sharp fall that we have seen in commodity prices. But overall, we could say that there was very good progress. The region had also started, engaging into the African continental free trade area, like engaging toward more trade integration, regional trade integration that promised to be a game changer for the region and enhance the medium-term growth prospects.
And that has been delayed, I understand?
That has been delayed. We just hope that this is a temporary delay and that countries will resume after that this push toward greater trade integration because it will help enhance people's livelihood, it will help increase income in the region. So this current crisis is really a threat to all of this, and even things like the stabilization in debt dynamics that we've seen. We talked a lot in the past few years about debt vulnerabilities in the region, but there was stabilization in the debt dynamics thanks to very strong fiscal adjustments that were taken and measures taken by countries to deal with that, in particular in the oil-producing countries.
So do you believe that this is really a temporary interruption in all this?
Well, there's tremendous uncertainty right now. Our projections, which envisage essentially a 1.6% decline in growth for the region, Sub-Saharan Africa, in 2020, are predicated on the assumption that the crisis is going to be contained in the first half of this year, and that we'll start seeing some type of improvement in Q3 and Q4, again, essentially in the second half of this year. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty around it. There is also a lot of uncertainty around how long these low commodity prices that we see, like low oil prices, is going to last, because it's hurting quite a lot the oil exporting countries in the region. So the baseline projection is for some improvement in the second half and then in 2021. But even with that, I must stress that there will be large income losses from this crisis. By end of 2020, the region will still face income losses of about 200 billion relative to where we thought they would be just like 6 months ago. And compared with 2019, the income loss is about 100 billion. And going all the way through the medium term, if we can make any projection over the medium term, we are still expecting incomes to be like 4% below where we were expecting them to be 6 months ago. So this is the forecast that we currently have. But there are large downside risks to them, and one has to be mindful of that.
Indeed. Meanwhile, supporting the businesses and the healthcare systems through the worst of the pandemic will require a lot of government spending. Yeah. What does that mean for debt levels coming out of this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, let me say at the onset that the immediate priority is for countries to do whatever it takes, okay, to ramp up the health spending to contain the virus outbreak. And regardless of space and fiscal space and that position concerns. And the countries can also take measures. Once these measures to contain the virus are taken, countries can turn their attention to softening a bit the blow on households, on businesses, by taking measures to support the economy. And by that, I mean, implementing cash transfers or in-kind support to vulnerable households, including to the informal workers. As you know, the informal sector is large in many of these countries. We go from 40 to 70 or 80% in some cases. And in workers in those sectors rely on day-to-day work to bring in income and feed their families. So the containment measures and mitigation measures that countries have taken to limit the spread of the virus will take the toll, will have an impact on the livelihood of these people. And so the governments need to take the measures to support them. And once the crisis has passed, that's where we would recommend countries take the necessary measures to bring their fiscal position back on a path that's consistent with that sustainability. As I mentioned earlier, the debt vulnerabilities were elevated before the crisis. They were on a stable path thanks to all the progress that was made in terms of fiscal consolidation. That has been put upside down by the crisis. So it will be important as countries come out of the crisis to start bringing their fiscal position back on a sustainable footing.
And you mentioned earlier the drop in oil prices. To what extent will this latest drop in commodity prices, notably oil, hinder the region's economic recovery coming out of the crisis?
Yeah. And the drop in oil prices is really hitting very hard the oil exporting countries, which essentially are the largest economies in the region. You're talking about Nigeria, Angola, economies like that have a big weight in the output of the region. And when we just look at the projection, growth, which was relatively low, projected to remain relatively low in those countries, as they were still grappling with the 2015 decline in oil prices. Those growth projections have been revised significantly down, from 1.8% in 2019 to something like minus 2.8% in 2020. And when you compare to what we were projecting before, it's we have a 5% percentage point downward revision. So this is having a big impact. I must stress again that there's a lot of uncertainty around this projection because just of the difficulties in predicting the outlook for oil prices, for example. But even so, even if our baseline projection were to materialize, this is a big hit to our oil economies. And it's not just in terms of growth. I mean, they will suffer a sharp decline in revenue because in many of these countries, the economies are not very diversified. They are highly dependent on oil. And so fiscal position will deteriorate even more as their revenue dwindle and the need to ramp up health spending kick in, and also to try to support the economy. So they have limited fiscal space to do that, and will need the support from also the international community, try to reshuffle maybe within some of the budgetary envelope to reshuffle the priority spending. At the same time, the region also has a lot of countries that import oil and will therefore benefit from the lower oil prices. But I must say that no country will be spared. I mean, even if the decline in oil prices will benefit the oil importing countries, some of the other commodities that they export are also declining. So in overall, we will see very little improvement in terms of trade for most of the countries in the region. And on top of it, we have the effect that the fact that global demand, like the demand for the region's exports, are plummeting because of the toll that the crisis has had on the region's trading partners, notably Europe or the United States. So overall, I would say that these low oil prices will have a large negative effect on the region.
So, as you just said there, the region is subject to spillovers from the global economy that is hurting as well. But what would the failure to contain the virus within Sub-Saharan Africa mean for the rest of the world?
The region has, in general, weak health systems. So failing to contain this outbreak really would essentially stretch those weak health systems and have catastrophic, I would say, health and humanitarian consequences. And this will, in turn, risk undermining all the efforts that other countries have made in battling this outbreak. You cannot imagine that an unchecked outbreak within the region will stay within the region. It will ultimately spill back to countries outside the region and undermine the efforts that they've taken so far, and we are seeing some progress, at least some slowdown in the rate of infections and the number of deaths in other countries, and all that progress risks to be unwound if the pandemic or the outbreak is not contained within the region. So we are all in it together, and this is why it will be critical for the international community to come in and help out.
And that brings me to my last question. How can the international community help?
There are a lot of strengths. I mean, the ability for countries really to deal with this crisis effectively depends on the support that they will get from the international community. So in that respect, we have seen a lot of initiatives that try to provide significant financial resources for the countries in the region. For example, for the fund, we are set to provide about 11 billion to 38 countries that have requested assistance in recent weeks and have already started disbursing money to several of them. Immediate debt relief is also being provided to the most vulnerable of our members through the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. And what this support is doing is to free resources for health and social protection spending. About 19 countries have already benefited from this support, and a few more will receive support in a few weeks. Support is also being given to the G20 initiative to suspend, for example, official bilateral repayment for the poorest countries through end 2020. And this will provide further financial relief for the countries that are most vulnerable. So these are initiatives that have been taken very swiftly by the international community, and that more needs to be done. I mean, there are still tremendous financing needs for countries to deal with the crisis, and the fund has supported the G20 call for example, for the private sector to also do its part. So it will be a collective effort. It will need the participation of everyone for the region and the world to get out of this unprecedented crisis. But we have no doubt that the region is a region with tremendous strength and resilience, and it will ultimately overcome this challenge.
Let's hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Papa Ndiaye heads the Regional Studies Division in the IMF's African Department. You can read the latest regional economic outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa at imf.org. And if you like this podcast, subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Just search for IMF Podcasts and follow us on Twitter at IMF_podcast. Thanks for listening.